Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Talking Deals with David. Today, we're going to be talking about antitrust law and merger control and all the complexities that we've been seeing over the past couple of years, both in the US and in Europe. And so today, I'm going to be joined for the second time, and I think it's the first repeat guest, Jennifer Marsh. Actually, I don't see Jennifer. Well, we will hopefully get Jennifer back soon. But for now, we also have Alan Bachman, who's joining me, partner of mine at K&L Gates from our Washington, D.C. office. Thanks, Alan, for joining us for this.
My pleasure.
Yeah, it's going to be great. I know I've been hyping it up a lot in some of my posts. I think, but I don't think unreasonably so. I mean, to me, one of the things, Alan, that I've been seeing on the M&A side is just a lot more complexity around deals, and some of that, of course, is the regulatory side on the antitrust that we'll talk about. But it's also just, the economic headwinds that we're seeing globally, and the uncertainty around everything from interest rates to inflation to the war in Europe and lots of other components that are going into deals, and it's just making it, at least from my perspective, a really challenging deal environment. So we're seeing a lot of complexity around pricing, valuation, structure of deals, tax impact. So there's a lot of different factors. But the one thing that has really, I guess I shouldn't say surprised me, having gone through some of these cycles and administration changes in the US and elsewhere around over the years, but the antitrust piece of the puzzle, I think, has become, again, at least for a deal lawyer, a lot more interesting and challenging. And so it's really great to have you here to be able to talk a bit about what you're seeing in the merger control antitrust area over the last couple of years. Are you seeing similar things in terms of that rise of a more complex environment as you're looking at deals and trying to get them through?
Absolutely. You said it's a challenging deal environment. The Biden administration would say that is by design, right? They came out of the gate saying they were going to be more aggressive in antitrust enforcement. The White House spokesman, Tim Wu, said that the past 20 years of antitrust enforcement have been a failed experiment. And they were essentially pursuing an enforcement path that was designed to rein in what they've called rampant consolidation. So when you say a challenging deal environment, they're saying mission accomplished, right? That's what they're trying to do. And at first, it was really this is a little bit more political, but a lot of folks said it was more in line with Biden's pro-worker, pro-consumer sort of view of the world. But then when we started having inflation problems, on top of it, consolidation was blamed for inflation. So the double whammy of reasons that they're doing it, and without question, it's the most aggressive antitrust enforcement in 20 years, and it really has made deal lawyers think very carefully about the terms and all of their agreements in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, it really has, and as you said, if you've been doing this, long enough, you'll see different cycles, and I can remember, as administrations change, you would sort of read, similar things. Either, there's a much looser, regulatory environment around antitrust, or maybe it's a little bit, tougher. But this one, to me, seems a tad different in terms of just the focus that you're seeing out of the FTC and also the DOJ and also some of the more interesting, theories of harm and other things that they're bringing into deals that, at least from a deal lawyer's perspective, we're always used to just looking at sort of competitive overlaps, trying to identify where you might have those and what the risk levels are. But you're just seeing a lot more other things that you have to think about. And while we're talking about that, Jen, I think you're back on.
Apologies.
Right? Oh, no, that's okay. Well, we were all on and everything was great. And we were saying how wonderful all the sound and, video was. And then just as the camera went on, you went off. So I'm glad you're back. But Jen is joining us. I was saying, Jen, this is your second time doing one of these Talking Deals with David LinkedIn Live events. And I think you're the first, repeat participant. So I'm glad to have you back.
Thank you for having me.
returning champion, right? Returning champion.
Oh, definitely. Well, and people who watched the last one, I think we were talking, Jen, last time with Gabby about foreign direct investment and what's happening in the UK and Europe in that area. But on that one, someone else was going to join Gabby and me from Europe and was ill that day and wasn't able to make it. So you actually had zero preparation, dragged in at like
Keeps
the
it
last
exciting.
bit. And it's great, yeah, and it was a fantastic discussion. So no, I'm really happy to do this. So I was talking while you were off, and Al and I were sort of kicking around this idea that deals are becoming a lot more complex to get done, timing wise, structure wise. And for a lot of different reasons. Some more on the corporate side, like just the economic headwinds, but some very important ones on the regulatory side. Are you seeing the same added uncertainty, complexity when you're looking at deals from the merger control, antitrust side in UK and Europe?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even putting aside all the foreign investment stuff we were talking about last time and thinking purely in terms of merger control, it's so much less predictable when jurisdiction will be taken over your deal. So we often see situations where, maybe people didn't even think about UK merger control. And in fact, the UK Competition and Markets Authority wants to conduct an in-depth assessment. Maybe people didn't think about it because there was no turnover in the UK, but that's, that you're not safe on that basis. Just look at Meta Giphy or Sabre Fair Logics. There's any number of examples. And also, aside from are they going to take jurisdiction, we're seeing much more aggressive enforcement as well. So you might well get into a process that you didn't expect, and it's going to be really difficult. It's not, or it might be, as it's not just going to be sort of a tick box. Oh, there's an additional formality we didn't realize. It can be lengthy, time consuming, and expensive, and you might have to give divestments at the end of it that you didn't expect if you didn't think about the European angle at the outset.
Yeah, well, you really have to consider all of the different, countries where you may have, an impact. And I write a lot about, and of course we do a lot of work together on cross-border deals that do implicate, many different jurisdictions. And it's very challenging to be able to sort of balance those. And, some you may have an easier process, and, some you may have a much more challenging process. I think in the U.S., I always used to sort of at least feel like, compared to the U.K., where you had this voluntary filing regime, which I think is a bit foreign to people in the U.S. that are used to, ticking off sort of the HSR, thresholds and filing requirements, and then making a filing. In the UK, you have to sort of confront as an initial matter, whether or not you make a filing at all. And there's often different views from the sell side, who often are maybe pushing not to do a filing, and the buyer side, where you feel like you need to have that comfort or assurances around getting a clearance in your deal, rather than worry about having to hold it separate or divest after. Is it still that same kind of, it's still a voluntary regime in the UK, and do you still have those same kind of back and forth in terms of making a notification decision?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's still a voluntary regime, which is, as you say, is a sort of key difference with HSR and essentially with the European Commission regime as well. And so that means that, as a matter of law, you don't have to file just because any given threshold is reached. You don't have to submit a notification to the UK, and you can technically complete. But a lot of people say that's only technically. In fact, if the UK wants to take jurisdiction over a deal and you go ahead and complete, then they will often put in place very aggressive holds. You could call them hold separate commitments. The technical term is an initial enforcement order that's going to require you to hold that business separate while the CMA conducts its review. So you might think, oh, we've got a voluntary regime here. I think I've heard of them. Maybe it was Singapore, maybe Australia. I know how voluntary regime works. I can just sort of go ahead with my transaction, figure out what we're doing about the UK after. And then, in fact, if you get one of these initial enforcement orders, then maybe you're going to have to hold that whole business separate for, maybe even a year, and not go in and realize the synergies that you're expecting to realize, maybe not go in and make the changes in management that you thought you were going to make to sort of make changes early on. You're going to have to prop up a business for this extended period of time while the review goes on. So it's still, that's very much, it's still a voluntary regime, but over time, it's just the commitments to hold separate and the this instances where that comes up have maybe become more common. Another factor on that front is Brexit. So where the UK left the EU. And so that means, whereas previously, if you were making a filing to Brussels, an EU filing, you wouldn't have had to think about the UK regime, just not at all. It's not, is it voluntary? Is it mandatory? It's just covered by Brussels. Whereas now, post Brexit, regardless of what Brussels is doing, there's a separate question as to whether the UK authority could take jurisdiction. You could be back into all of these issues that we've just spoken about.
Well, Ian, actually, Alan has an interesting, question about thinking about how do you profile acquisitions? Are there ways that you can sort of reduce the risk that your deal, might be subject to antitrust scrutiny? Let's just take the U.S. We know there are certain industries. It seems like to me that whether it's tech or healthcare, certain areas that the U.S. Antitrust agencies seem to be particularly focused on. But how do you think about a deal at sort of the earliest phases? I mean, to me, thinking about the planning, the antitrust implications really much earlier than maybe we've even done in the past makes a lot of sense given where things are shaking out. But how do you think about that in terms of from the buy side as you're looking at potential deals and assessing where you might see potential problems, risks, timing issues?
All right, so this used to be a much easier question than it is right now. So we're going to start with the old easy answer, which was, are you horizontal competitors? Do you share the same customers? Will those customers have concerns that the transaction would allow you to increase prices to them? If you're not in that zone, you're probably in a safe zone. You might have vertical issues that have an inquiry. There might be a lot of reasons you could get calls from regulators. But traditionally, the idea was, are you horizontal competitors? And to shoot right at the question, I think those are the types of targets that are contentious, and all the others you put in the generally non-contentious category. However, the Biden administration has just rewritten the rule book, right? They have brought a number of challenges to purely vertical transactions, taking them to court, right? With mixed results, but generally losing them because traditionally vertical transactions are pro-competitive, been used by the courts at least to be pro-competitive and not in violation of the Clayton Act. Now, moreover, there's a recent announcement that the agencies are going to be issuing new merger guidelines in which they're really going after private equity consolidation and going after roll-ups, right? Again, this used to be a space that was fairly non-contentious, right? Imagine a company that rolls up small, auto parts suppliers throughout the United States or something like that, buying one shop region by region, not generally something that would ever be an issue. The agencies, or at least they're rumored to be saying that they may be interfering with a company's ability to roll up and create a national footprint because that gives you market power that you wouldn't have had before. Similarly, they are really targeting private equity in the degree to which they are consolidating power across businesses in a given industry. There are rumors that they're saying, hey, your deal might not be contentious, but we hear there are 3 or 4 more behind it. Therefore, we're going to stop yours. I mean, that is all new, really new concerns that previously as counselors to deal lawyers and clients, we would never be worried about. And as a result, when you're in those spaces, in other words, are you advising a private equity client that has other investments in the sector? Are you advising a roll-up? You need to be a lot more thoughtful about your deal documents and give yourself the time to resolve regulatory concerns if you're in that area. Again, speaking to the question, those are now new areas of contention: vertical deals, roll-up deals, private equity deals. Where before there were, at most you might have gotten a call in the first 30 days. Now you could be looking at far more serious investigations. So
it sounds like from that answer, Alan, that like you started off by saying, it used to be you could focus on just sort of, are we in competitive space, geographies, products? Are there overlaps? But it sounds like it's a much more wide ranging kind of inquiry. So you don't have kind of the benchmarks. I think Ian had these concept in his questions about rules of thumb. Of course, there are, some guidelines, especially when you're talking about horizontal competitors, but you really need to just dig in very carefully and think about what your acquisition is and how it's going to fit with your overall profile. You mentioned this roll up that I know we've talked about in the past. That's always been a focus, but it seems to be a much more hyper laser focus on especially from the private equity side. And are these deals, because I think there's a lot of confusion about this, even though we have this HSR mandatory notification, and that has been bumping up. That threshold bumps up, as inflation does, and over time. But that doesn't mean that deals beneath that level are somehow safe or cleared or don't require the same thinking. Particularly if you're doing this roll up, where you might have a lot of different acquisition targets that individually aren't near the triggering threshold for an HSR filing, but over time can create that market power. Are you seeing more? Is there more enforcement action of deals under the threshold, or does it matter? Is there some limit where it doesn't much matter? The deal's so small that you don't have to spend a lot of time thinking about the antitrust piece?
So I wouldn't say more. The agencies have always made clear that they every year they will review what they view as problematic transactions that fell under the merger thresholds that they feel harmed competition. Every year they bring a couple, investigation into a $12 million deal, a $15 million deal, really to show industry that they're watching, right? And that's always there. What's new is the concept of a widening of the range of what they might view as problematic, right? When you're doing a roll up and you might buy a different small business at different regions throughout the United States, again, businesses that only compete regionally with their other competitors, the idea that you would acquire them and create a national footprint has historically never been any of a problem. There's no theory of harm there that has ever, certainly one that's ever been tested, suggesting that kind of roll up would be a problem. And the agencies are just saying, look, we think this is a problem. That gives you some kind of market power that you'd only have through those acquisitions. And this administration has no problems pushing the envelope, bringing theories of harm, and bringing cases that lose in court because they want to really tamp down on what they view as excessive consolidation. Now, again, this is a little bit of rumor mill. We're anticipating that these might come out before the American Bar Association antitrust spring meeting at the end of this month. But there's no question. I mean, the agencies have pulled their vertical merger guidelines, right? They're issuing new merger guidelines. We know there's going to be stuff about private equity and about roll-ups in there that weren't there in their past. Again, the idea that somehow they would say, look, your deal is not problematic, but we see others coming in the industry, therefore we're going to stop this now. I mean, there's no theory of harm there that would, in my mind, would survive a legal challenge in court. But they're trying to push the envelope and be aggressive and bring these cases and try to establish some new law in this space. And so I think our advice to clients and to M&A partners is don't put yourself in a position where you might be the test case they want to use to establish new law, right? And certainly don't do deals if it's going to draw attention, as you say, to 10 or 12 in the past that were perhaps below the HSR thresholds that might now be something they'd be trying to chase down and go after.
Yeah, well, let's circle back on that, especially when we're talking about sort of what kind of approach you have to take when you're doing a challenging deal, because you have to kind of steel yourself for a different enforcement environment. And and as you say, their win-loss record isn't great, at least so far. I guess we'll see how that that develops, but that plays into it, especially in some of the big headline deals where people are just being more aggressive, I think, and saying we might have to litigate some of these. But Jen, let me take it back, because I think for a lot of people that do deals from the U.S. side, it's very confusing when you start thinking about competition law in Europe and in the UK. So again, with the idea that probably most of the people listening to this are going to be more M&A lawyers or PE or corporate development type people who are actually doing deals. How do you kind of explain the European UK overlay? When do you have notifications that have to go to the EU as a whole versus member states and versus the UK? Are you making essentially multiple filings in multiple jurisdictions? And how do you create like a unified approach to deal with that, so that you're not, so that you have some kind of a theme or a story that you're using, as you're going into different jurisdictions? And does that create any additional complexity challenges, the fact that you may have to navigate these multiple trigger points in different countries?
Yeah, I mean, all good questions. Yeah, and I mean, as you say, it's essential to be joined up, including with the US, because we have to be joined up because all of the regulators absolutely are. There's rumor, some suspicions these days that the UK authorities are talking to the US authorities even more than the European Commission. So everything has to be absolutely aligned. And one key thought will always be, if you're making a filing, say you're making an HSR filing, that would increase your risk that it will get picked up, the deal will get picked up in the UK. So you need to think about that. I mean, I think as Alan's been explaining, we're operating in an environment of a lot less certainty now than I would say a couple of years ago. So how do we help people manage that? Well, we still start, I would say, with our traditional analysis, which some of your listeners might be familiar with, where we get a sales breakdown. So where is the target in particular generating sales throughout the world, from customers in which jurisdictions. But whereas that used to be kind of, let's analyze the turnover figures, let's check them against the thresholds, maybe let's get a bit more asset information, and that would be sort of the beginning and end of the process. There's now I would say a whole different layer on top of that of, so in the UK, for instance, you'll think about what is the target turnover, you might get some market share data, but you'll then go through an additional level of inquiry, probably with your client, where you try and understand if there is in fact a competition issue. Is there something that the CMA would find interesting and want to get their teeth into? And as Alan says, again, it's not just are they competing, it's they love, I mean, for instance, so the higher profile sectors at present, digital and pharma. The CMA loves talking about, are these acquirer and target, are they in the same ecosystem? So even if they're not the same competitors in the same market, can you see how they can leverage what they're doing in one market into another market? I mean, I guess a lot of these authorities feel they sort of missed something with the acquisitions a few years ago, the likes of Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram, etc. And so there maybe they weren't exact competitors, but it was sort of all the data that you could leverage from one market into another and use it to sort of entrench your position. So yeah, so we'll ask ourselves, is there a story here that the UK authorities might be interested in? And if there is, even though there might be an argument that the thresholds aren't met, we might well submit a short briefing paper to the CMA. It's quite a common approach. So it's meant to be a 5-page document. You proactively put that into the CMA. It's not a notification. It's a very sort of polite, we wanted to tell you, CMA, about this transaction. Maybe you're going to see it from filings in other jurisdictions. Here's why we don't think you should take jurisdiction. And it means that the CMA should consider earlier whether to take jurisdiction over your transaction. And if they say they're not going to, then that gives you some more confidence to proceed with your deal. But I mean, there's, as you say, David, there's very similar things going on in the EU. And yeah, I mean, in the EU, the question is, traditionally, do you meet these very high turnover thresholds? So typically you need a target of generating at least 100 million euros in the EU. It's complicated, but let's go with that as a ballpark. And then if you don't meet those thresholds, then you'd consider the member state filings. So we don't have an EU filing. Let's think about, do we meet the German thresholds? Do we meet the French thresholds? And you might go for member state clearances. But now in Europe, to add to the uncertainty that we're talking about generally, even if you don't have an EU filing, and even if in fact you don't have a member state filing with Germany or France, there is nevertheless a mechanism for a member state to say, we think you, European Commission, should look at this deal, notwithstanding it doesn't meet any thresholds. And some people may have seen that in Illumina Grail. So
and is that so in those deals, it's you can't predict that, I presume. I mean, you wouldn't normally do a briefing paper or something like that if you didn't meet any of the thresholds in any of the member jurisdictions. So how do parties respond to something like that? Is that something you anticipate as part of the transaction document, or does that result in some additional delay if one of the member states or the EU picks that up?
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, the whole mechanism is being challenged before the Court of Justice of the EU. So we'll see where that comes out. But in the meantime, yeah, I think absolutely you need to think about it for your deal documents. Maybe you want to have a longer period to allow for regulatory clearances, even though you're not sort of specifically getting a CP. It's sort of if a process emerges and what would happen if it emerged and how long would you have to wait and cooperate with each other to try and get that through. What do you want to do about break fees, etc. You need to, yeah, anticipate these uncertainties. I mean, I would say that I think it's particularly in digital, and there's particular sectors where you can anticipate these issues coming up a bit more frequently. I mean, Illumina Grail, as people may know, is a pharma. It's a blood test for an early detection of cancer. So that we can predict to some extent, but again, it's much more. We need to understand the story and how it's likely to. How could it pique the interest of the competition authorities over here, whereas we used to just be able to look at turnover thresholds.
And how do you get to turnovers? We've had a couple of questions more on the technical side of things. I know for one thing, as you're thinking about this, particularly between competitors, one of the issues that we always face in almost every transaction on the M&A side is how do we, collect the information that you need, share the information in a way that doesn't itself violate some anti-competitive thing, using clean teams or other sorts of mechanisms to try to, cabin off or ring fence, particular information. But I don't believe there is, right? But is there a particular source for getting things like what is the turnover in particular jurisdictions? Or are you essentially relying on the parties to provide estimates of percentage market shares or turnovers as you're looking at a country by country basis, particularly on a larger cross-border deal where you may have, extensive connections to various jurisdictions?
Yeah, on the turnover side, we would normally rely on the parties, and often the target turnover is the most important one to get. What we often have a problem where turnover is initially presented to us on the basis of the company making the sale, so the subsidiary of the target entities. Say the subsidiary is based in UK and it makes sales all around Europe or something. Well, we need the breakdown by the customers all around Europe. We can't just use we can't say the turnover is all attributable to the UK because that's where the selling subsidiary is, as a general rule. But yeah, we need to depend on the parties normally for that. And in terms of sharing the data, we would often do it from external counsel on an external counsel only basis. So directly from the merger control advisor for the target to the merger control advisor for the acquirer. And we find that quite an efficient way of doing it. On market share data, we would normally, especially if we need to examine it in more detail, maybe there's an overlap. Ideally, we would look to discuss that with the parties, but ideally we would be bringing it back to maybe a market report that's generally accepted in the industry. We would also often look at previous decisions of the competition authorities. Have they looked at a market previously? Have they defined the market? And even more helpfully, do they have some recent market share data for what they thought at the time each party had? I would say clean teams is a slightly different one. That's more, so say you've got two merging competitors. It's not so much about the merger control analysis in my experience. It's just, we acquirer want to do our diligence on the target, but we accept that we shouldn't have full visibility of all of their confidential information in case the deal doesn't happen and we need to start competing again. And in that situation, it might be appropriate to form a clean team at the acquirer side to analyze the data on the target and then keep that team apart from key decisions for a period afterwards while they're sort of cleaned of the competitively sensitive information they saw from the failed deal.
I see. That makes sense. Well, Alan, one of the things that Dan mentioned that I'm interested in is, one of the things I've always really found fascinating about antitrust law is it is kind of an interesting blend between corporate litigation, because you have to kind of always be preparing, I guess, for the possibility that you may be in more of a combative adversarial type posture with the government or private parties even. But also things like what's the market and defining the market. It involves a lot of creativity and
Okay.
knowledge about the world and how consumers operate and how business operates. So you have that interplay between those. Is that still an important thing in terms of how you present your story and how you frame the market and organize that? Or is it because the U.S. authorities now are almost maybe taking in some positions, we don't really care, we're not talking to you, we're not engaging with you in
No.
any meaningful degree? Or is that still a key part of what you do every day as you're
No,
working through?
you described the job perfectly. That's what it is. It's a mix of corporate law, right? Economics, economic analysis, what you describe in markets, and if you have to, litigation. I certainly wouldn't say that the agency saying we don't care. It's really if you imagine they've just widened the lens of the things that they discuss. So the first thing we saw in our practice when the Biden administration got announced how aggressive they're going to be is tons of deals that otherwise never would have gotten a call got small investigations. We called them tire kicking. Like, hey, we want to look at this. I mean, we had a deal where the parties didn't have a vertical relationship or a horizontal relationship. They're just sort of in the same space. One quick call, maybe gone in 10 days, right? They've announced that they're looking at private equity and roll-ups in a way that they've never really looked at before. Circling back to the clean team discussion we just had, I've had a couple of sort of arm wrestling matches with private equity investors and corporate lawyers saying, what are you talking about? We need a clean team here. We're not in this space. And I'm saying, look, the agencies have said they're concerned about, for example, killer acquisitions where maybe you're buying a company that doesn't compete with you now, but that might in the future, or are you considering entering this space instead of making this acquisition? These are all the kinds of things the agencies have announced they're worried about now. And so you want to make sure your clients have put protocols in place so that if they do get one of these quick investigations, they don't find something they don't like and they just move on to something else, right? And so as a result, we've been encouraging clients to exercise more caution in all those spaces. But there's no question that essentially the battleground is the same as far as market analysis, market share. They simply expanded to some new considerations. In other words, the degree to which a vertical transaction may foreclose competitors. Also, which there's a set of economic analysis for and market definition analysis. Here's the key: there in the United States, anyway, they've simply demonstrated far more willingness to challenge transactions when their cases are weaker. Right? It used to be that if the agencies brought a case against you to block a merger, they had the goods. They really didn't like losing cases and setting precedent that would hurt the agencies. This administration has made it clear they are not afraid to bring close cases or even cases I suspect that internally they think they have the worst of, because they want to show that they're aggressively trying to resist the consolidation that the Biden administration broadly thinks is bad. But the battleground, like you said, the economic analysis and then if the terms that you litigate on are all the same. I mean, the issue the Biden administration is having is that there's a large set of precedent out there that is really working against their agenda. I mean, there's case law that flies in the face of some of the cases they're bringing.
Yeah, well, let me take it because I thought what you said there was really fascinating. Let me take it back sort of from the M&A side. Many deals. Let's take aside, the big ones that the parties just know they're going to be in a knockdown drag out. It's airlines or big tech or something like that, where you're going from a 3-2 or a 2-1 or something where you just you're going to be in a fight. But sometimes parties, right, will continue to do those, and they'll litigate them or have super large break fees or whatever that they're going to do. But taking out those, the normal deal or at least a very typical structure of a deal is you'll say to a buyer, because certainty of closing from the sell side is really critical, right? So you don't want to enter into a deal that you can't get done. There's no benefit to doing that, and it would be better to take a lower price but actually get the deal done in a reasonable time. So sellers are very interested in that. So a lot of times you'll see covenants where the buyer will do everything it can do reasonably, and there's different standards and language, and people will spend a lot of time negotiating those, but it often will say, but you don't have to, the buyer will not have to litigate against the government, sell the assets that it's acquired or its own assets, and there's various standards of that. But and that makes sense to me under what you just said, because if the government does bring a case, let's say in the older days, a couple of years ago, it usually had the goods, meaning that the very bringing of the case was in essence a proxy for, you're probably going to lose. You're probably not going to get this deal through, at least in the form that you anticipated. So the parties then could walk, pay a fee, maybe, go their separate ways. And that was the way it is. But today, if litigation is being brought that maybe is not so good or not so promising, are you seeing parties now pushing, especially from the sell side, to say, wait a second, you need to have a covenant to potentially litigate. We need you as the buyer to push harder and resist more, because there may be some cases that they're bringing that you're going to ultimately prevail on. But if we let you out too easy, then we're not going to be able to get that closing certainty that we need. Are you seeing changes in what you're doing on those sort of covenants and closing conditions, and what buyers have to do to get a deal through?
So the short answer is, without question, seeing more terms and agreements that impose a dual obligation on the parties to litigate. And more importantly, just giving the parties more time to do so, because this increased enforcement. More time is the key, right? Now, I would say what you just talked about is a really fact-intensive inquiry for clients, right? Some sellers absolutely want to make sure that there's every requirement to get the deal closed, including litigation. But litigation can take time, right? I mean, and sellers are also sometimes worried about their business deteriorating over the window that a deal is held open. So they may want to have sort of an escape valve. So you really need to sort of talk to your client about that when you're trying to sort it out, right? If the client is like, I'm out of this business, we're selling one way or another, once we're on the market, it's over, we need to get a deal closed with them or someone else if it fails, then I'd say, hey, lock the buyer in. But I've certainly seen instances where we've represented clients who said, look, we'd like to have a little bit more flexibility to eject ourselves if we think we're running into a buzzsaw of litigation, and meanwhile our customers are wondering whether they should be doing business with us, right? So you really need to sort those things through with your client on the front end, knowing that you may have these issues that take a year and a half to play out.
Now, you mentioned, Alan, this idea of killer acquisitions, and I know I posted a bit about that as we were sort of doing the lead up, to talking today. And Jen, then I want to flip it to you, because I know it seems to be, at least the reporting is that's a very big focus. But I want to make sure that everybody sort of understands what that is. Alan, is that a deal where you don't necessarily have a real competitive overlap or negative competitive impact right now, but that there's technology or data or information or other things that a larger, well-financed, person acquiring that could then shut it down or dampen competition, use it in other ways in its business that could be anti-competitive? What does that mean when you talk about a killer acquisition, and how is the U.S. sort of working to address that?
So the idea is a large, well-established company buying a potential competitor that could threaten their business model, in its infancy, before it's even clear to the rest of the world where it's going. And I think it's really helpful to understand the best example of why the agencies are doing what they're doing and what they've used, right? Facebook acquired Instagram when Instagram was small. No one thought that Instagram was a real competitor to Facebook. It was just a place you put pictures up. What they realized a decade later is that had it been allowed to grow and that transaction been blocked, at least this is the argument, is that perhaps Instagram would have developed into all the features that Facebook have, and there would have been two competing with each other for these big social networks, right? That's the idea. Whether that is or isn't true, I'm not stating a claim to, but the FTC anyway, it thinks that that's the prime example of an instance where it didn't appear like Facebook was doing anything other than just buying a new feature. But a heavier investigation may have exposed that those kind of transactions should be stopped. And more importantly, let's just stop them across the board, right? And then that's the new thing. We're just going to block anything like that and let things grow and develop. That's my perspective in the U.S. Jen, how are things viewed over in Europe?
Yeah, I mean, it's very much a parallel concern that I would say sits behind a lot of what we've been talking about since right at the beginning. You know, why have we moved away from a classic analysis of jurisdictional thresholds? It was great. It gave everybody loads of certainty. It's because of precisely this kind of issue where, okay, you can't judge how competitively important a target is based on its existing turnover. As Alan says, you know, maybe Instagram didn't have that much turnover at the time, but it had the potential, so the argument goes, to have a huge volume of turnover and to be this huge competitor to Facebook. So one thing you see the authorities doing over here is looking more at transaction value thresholds. Certainly Germany and Austria have done that. So it's no longer let's just look at the turnover thresholds. Let's have a transaction value threshold. Why is Facebook willing to pay that much for Instagram? Is that apparent that it would want to pay that much from the turnover? What multiple of EBITDA is this? And you actually see that a lot generally, I would say, that focus on what is the acquirer willing to pay for this? Was it more than others were willing to pay for it, say in an auction scenario? And if so, why? Why does that company attribute so much more value to this target than others in the market? So it's this kind of paranoia or legitimate concern, whatever you want to call it, that maybe the regulators missed some transactions that they should have raised more queries about, created more obstacles to a couple of years ago, and therefore I think has led maybe to the harsher enforcement environment we're in now.
Oh, that's interesting. So they're using maybe what they view as excessive valuation metrics or something like that as almost a proxy to say there must be something going on, beneath the surface. This particular large, it seems to happen a lot in tech, but I guess it could happen in pharma or anything else. So is that what you're saying, Jen, that they're using that as a way of saying we should poke into this a little more detail, maybe so we don't miss what Alan described in sort of the Facebook, Instagram situation?
Yeah, definitely. I would say it's a bit of a hot topic from what we see over here. I mean, another thing that's happening is really extended pre-merger or pre-notification discussions. So before you even notify, you end up in this sort of lengthy process with the UK, the EU authorities making rounds and rounds of submissions. And we've certainly seen our pre-notification discussions heavily extended, maybe backed up with some internal document, a more extensive internal document requests in situations where the authority thinks that something doesn't quite stack up about the valuation. We would say that there could be other reasons for it. Maybe our client had better access to funds because it's, our client, the acquirer, is doing so well. It's got better financing, and therefore it can just outbid all of the others who may want to pay more, may attribute more value, but can't spend that much right now. But yes, it's certainly a high purchase price, especially high relative to others, is creating a lot of questions right now. And it's a sort of similar phenomenon, I guess, to a couple of years ago. Everyone would say, and we'd still say, be really careful of your internal documents. Before you're even talking to me or Alan, maybe before you're even talking to you, David, make sure you're not creating sort of internal documents, IMs and what have you, that make it sound like this target is sort of dominating the market, or that this is a 1 to 2 type situation. They haven't really got any competitors other than maybe their prime target to be acquired by. That these are the things that are going to give you much more grief in an already aggressive enforcement environment.
Well, it's perfect, and it actually leads to a couple things. Ian, you have a question on auctions, and does that create a situation where if you have different categories of buyers, how do you sort of rank them? And at least in my experience, absolutely that makes a difference. I mean, you're always looking at sort of those big 3 or 4 things, price, certainty of closing, timing, people, culture, meshing. Those 3 or 4 things, you always in your mind try to, I guess, kind of risk adjust. And, price obviously is a primary concern for most sellers, but, a price for a deal that doesn't get done, doesn't seem like a great success. Now, again, you can use reverse termination fees, break fees, expense reimbursements, other sorts of things. And Alan, you touched on a couple of things that we're seeing now, even things like ticking fees, which you used to see, back in the day, are coming back to kind of compensate sellers or their shareholders. You're even seeing those in public deals where you're getting like a per share ticking fee as deals may take longer and longer, because it may take a year or 18 months or maybe even longer to navigate through, all of these different U.S. and European antitrust merger control things or other regulatory things. So I do think if you have a buyer that presents a very nice offer, but it is heavily risky or contingent based on other factors, it wouldn't make a lot of sense to, not risk adjust that pricing. And I think most sellers will do that. But Alan, Lucas has a question that builds on what, Jen, you were starting to talk about. And this gets to that overlay of kind of the quasi litigation things, which I find, at least as a corporate lawyer, really fascinating about what you both do. You do have to be thinking, right, about what your client is preparing internally in terms of market studies, emails, text messages, any kind of communication, because, and I think, or do we still refer to those as like 4C documents or other kinds of documents? But could you maybe touch a little bit about on the importance of being disciplined when you're describing potential acquisitions internally, when you're communicating about those acquisitions, things that you don't want to see, I guess, Alan, when you're, on the receiving end of looking at the pile of documents and then finding that one and you say, why did they say that? Right. I mean, that sometimes happens.
Right. So the short answer is, for a U.S. filing, you have to submit a set of things that are called 4C documents. These are documents that discuss competition writ broad in the industry, that were prepared for officers or directors of the company for purposes of evaluating the transaction. Those are the documents, that's the universe that you need to be the most careful with, because those go in with the filing. That's what the agencies look at to start. And here, Lucas has asked for best practice. The best practice is tell everyone in your company to make sure that anything they draft like that at the first stage is labeled draft, and make sure that lawyers get to see it first, because you only have to submit final versions with your filing. So in other words, if your draft says we're going to acquire X that allow us to crush the competition, then you send it to the lawyers and say, no, you don't want to have that in there. We advise you to say we want to acquire X because it's going to let us grow our sales, right? And then you make that the final, right? That's and when we have clients who've worked with us multiple times, they get much better at that, right? Whether it's you want to make sure that your marketing memorandums, your presentations, all get vetted through lawyers before you circulate them, because those are all going to be 4C documents. And that's the universe. There's very little you can do about deeper into your organization, emails among salespeople, but those are not documents that go in with your filing. Those are documents that get discovered in the course of a second request. The second best practice, if you really want to try to shield your organization, if you're doing a lot of acquisitions, is to have some antitrust training put in, to have folks in your sales, in particular, sales and marketing department, and your business development department be savvy about the documents they create. Like, get a little bit of antitrust training. The unfortunate reality is, what's really great for business, right? Dominating a market, having a monopoly, having a unique thing that you can price high margins. All those things are bad for our antitrust arguments, and vice versa, right? When you're getting killed by the competition, that makes life easy for your antitrust lawyers, right? And those documents that say that stuff are strong. That's the reality of this kind area of legal work.
Yeah, it is. Well, Jen, I want to know a little bit about, how did you get interested in doing this kind of work, and sort of, because I don't think we've talked about that, but I'm very curious about it. You're always, very upbeat, enthusiastic, which I love, and I try to do myself, and I do that a little bit on LinkedIn, trying to get sort of a, our jobs can be challenging in terms of just the stress, the time, all of those factors. But how did you decide you wanted to do antitrust competition type work? And are you glad that you went into that area?
Well, I'm definitely glad I went into this area. Let's start with that one. I guess, one of the reasons I started this was because I was, so keen on the EU, and it was a sort of European area of competition law. And I speak German, and I spent a lot of time in Berlin and so on, and Munich. But that hasn't worked out for me so well since Brexit. But fortunately, I'm left with with still enjoying what I do. I guess it's always been a case of having to understand clients' businesses quite in depth to advise them well. To understand these merger control risks, we really have to understand the business as well, and how what the target does could relate to what the acquirer does. And I like the sort of fast pace of doing these transactions periodically. So yeah, I don't know. I hope you're going to put that question to Alan too.
Yeah, no, I'm definitely. Yeah, Alan. I mean, do like a lot of people, I think when they're corporate lawyers, they think it's you have to be an economist, or I assume you have to be generally reasonably good with numbers, and at least thinking through economic concepts, because it has that overlay. But yeah, how did you get into doing merger analysis, antitrust law?
So I actually I got interested before law school on the economic side, and I approached it from that angle, and I quickly realized I wasn't really good at linear algebra and more sophisticated math. And it seemed to me that the lawyers were kind of running the show. I was actually an analyst at DOJ, where I got to see both and how both worked. I'm like, I want to go be a lawyer, but in this space. I knew it when I went to law school. And I'd say the thing that's really great about it is that you keep learning new industries, right? If you work for Nike, you can be really wealthy and really successful, but you're always dealing with shoes, and maybe you love shoes, and that's great. But for me, I wanted to learn about lots of different industries. And if you do antitrust law over 10 and 20 years, you do everything from scrap metal to, sophisticated genetics to, things that go into your iPhone. I've looked at all those industries and how they work, and frequently you're at the table with the lawyers and the executives. You also get to be involved in, high stakes deal work, which is fun and exciting and, stressful at times as well. You get to litigate, you get to do corporate work. It's this wonderful mix of things that really attracted me to the field.
Yeah, it's really true. And I know people in our side of work, you're often kind of instructed, well, it's important from a client perspective to really understand the business. And you're told that, generally. But sometimes when you think, well, how do I do that? What does that really mean? And, it's a bit more challenging. And what I'm always impressed by is, Jen, both when we've worked on deals, but it's really true, I imagine with antitrust lawyers generally, within a day or 24 hours, 48 hours, I mean, the ability to really drill down into what makes a business tick and what the drivers are, I've always found very incredible. So you either have incredible capacity to do that, or just the experience in doing it. But it's really important to be very, very specific. I notice when you do analysis, or, we're working through deals, there's a lot of technical pieces that go with it, but you also have that overarching, story, which I always think is very interesting. What's the, story behind the deal and the people that are involved in it? And that can make have a real impact on the outcome of the transaction. But then at the same time, you're always oscillating between these very technical, economic arguments or other things that, that are part of that. But how do you approach that, Jen? Like, do you like kind of doing that high level work, and then the more detailed work that you have to do when you're analyzing markets or products?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I guess that's the technical side is hopefully where we're adding value. Business folks, the clients that explain their business to us, they're doing it so that we can then advise them on how that fits in with all of the technical regime that hopefully Alan and I have got plenty of expertise on. And yeah, I mean, I obviously you should never dig into a client's business for the sake of it, but if that makes sense and you need to understand more, I mean, we'll normally send out a couple questions first of all to understand the overlaps and the potential sectors at issue and so on. But if we need to dig deeper, then it's often a case of getting business folks on the call who maybe don't interact with the lawyers that often, and sort of and it could be, it could be that there's some big deal, and actually there's 9 sectors at issue, and none of them are really that important for the merger control analysis. There's maybe this one little business which is the area of overlap, and you really need to dig into that, and it all hinges on that, and you'll be speaking to the business people in that small segment of the business, and really getting to the minutiae of how that works and who the customers are, and are they target and acquire perceived as close competitors, and so on. And to your point, David, about the story, I would say it's so important that we know what the story is before we have to start engaging with the authorities. I mean, it's a real problem, or it really puts us at a disadvantage when we end up in these situations where, we've got a letter from the CMA asking about a deal. Maybe it's been notified in the US, and nobody's thought about UK or Europe yet. And we have to, in a few days, get all the technical answers to the questions and think about what our story is. It's so much better if we've thought about it in advance, and we're then teaching the competition authority what we think the story is and how they should be looking at the market, and how this ties in with our internal documents, how it ties in with their previous cases. So yeah, I guess that's what we're often trying to do, is sort of build the story that's accurate and that's gonna persuade the authority and teach them how to look at it.
Well, it's so important to be, and I write about this a lot just from the corporate side, but just hearing this discussion with you and Alan today, it's so critical to be proactive instead of reactive, thinking through almost like a chess, game or something like that, where you're thinking many moves ahead about what can happen, what are the alternatives, and then trying as best you can to sort of plan for those. But Alan, I guess as we wrap it up, what would you sort of give as the takeaways as we're, kind of, I guess, into 2023? We have a little bit now backdrop. Are you kind of waiting anxiously for the merger guidelines? Do you see any major deal structuring or trends that folks should watch out for as we're kind of moving through a bit of an uncertain, unstable, volatile 2023?
Well, so I wouldn't worry so much about the merger guidelines, and they'll be very interesting in our field and give us some sense of where the agencies are headed. But as far as clients and corporate lawyers are concerned, the issue you need to be thinking about, in my mind, are remedies on your deals. We haven't talked about that yet, right? The Assistant Attorney General of the DOJ Antitrust Division has announced that they don't think most remedies work. And I don't think in the past 2 years they've actually settled a dispute that allowed a divestiture. We've had deals here where we offered we offered divestitures. The DOJ staff said, look, traditionally we would have accepted this, but the new policy is no. So when you're, essentially, we traditionally, there are these hell or high water clauses, right, where the buyer says, look, we'll sell off whatever we need to sell off to get this deal done. And now the agency is saying there's nothing you can do, right? So what do you do in that world? Well, you could be put in a place where you have to sell the whole company you bought. So that means you need to be far more careful about those terms. You need to consider how they're worded. You need to have escape clauses. You need to consider how far you're going to litigate. And frankly, we're advising clients you can't sign that stuff. The better course is a breakup fee that the seller's comfortable with if you get to a point where you either lose in court or you don't want to litigate it and you walk away. There's essentially there is a world in which there are far few fix opportunities than there were in the past.
Yeah, it's definitely true, and I've written a little bit about that you're getting, you're not able to necessarily get approvals or resolution of
right.
What you might have done in the past, right, with potential divestitures. And one thing great about that period is antitrust always has interesting things, whether it's like names for things like killer acquisition or fix it first, trying to resolve some of these issues before you even go before the agencies, do a divestiture or try to move, boxes around so that maybe address some of the concerns that you have, or just, I guess what you're referring to, Alan, is maybe isn't the phraseology now, litigate the fix. So that sometimes these agencies in the US are just saying, we're not interested in your proposed resolution. But if you're willing to litigate it, companies have been finding some success with that, right? Where the courts are saying, hey, your fix is okay. It works.
Yeah. I mean, look, the example is the parties have a huge business. They've got a narrow overlap and they say, look, DOJ, we're going to divest that overlap, right? And what the agencies are saying, look, traditionally, a lot of the times those divestitures don't work if it's not a complete business, if you're hodgepodging this thing together, and we don't like it anymore. So instead of working those things out, we're just going to challenge the transaction and see how it plays out. The courts are saying, well, look, they've proposed a fix. And, what's your problem with the fix? And then the agency says, well, look, sometimes they don't work. That tends to lose in court. So in other words, the agencies are having a little bit of a struggle getting the courts to support their new resistance to these remedies, which puts the parties in a position where, you got to go to the mat and you got to give yourself time to litigate it. And you got to litigate that fix. You also need to have the deal lawyers, understanding what that fix is, having a buyer on board that's ready to testify how successful they're going to be, have it all lined up. But you can see how much more time and effort you need to plan into your deal and make sure the transaction documents reflect both parties' intent on where they're going to go with that.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Jen, any final words from you on the UK European side as you're looking at 2023?
I guess just think about it early. There's a lot of things coming in the pipeline. Aside from all the merger control we've been looking at, which is still going to be aggressively enforced, I would say in 2023, we're seeing more foreign investment rules, and we've also got the foreign subsidy regulation coming in the EU, which means have you a US company, have you received funds from the state, and if so, you might have a whole third layer of regulatory scrutiny to go through. So I'd say get advice and get it early, if that's not too much of a cliche.
All right. Well, no, Jen, Alan, thank you so much. I think this really, for me, it's always great to learn, new things about this area. I think it's very important for M&A lawyers, passing familiarity with the things we talked about today and all the, great work that you both do on transactions and helping them, get through hopefully smoothly and quickly. So I appreciate it. We could lots more we could talk about. Maybe we can do sort of a follow up, and Jen, you could be the first three-peat return person on the show. But I appreciate your time and really informative. So thank you, Jen, and thanks, Alan. And of course, if people have questions, comments, send them to any of us. We're happy to talk about that. And if there's things that you'd like to hear more of, we can definitely do that. And then next week, I'm doing a conversation about creativity and M&A with Jeremy Utley from Stanford in his new book, which is called Idea Flow. And I'll also be joined by a partner of mine, Craig Budner, and we're going to talk with him about creativity and innovation. And so I think it should be an interesting discussion. So I hope everyone can join for that. So thanks, Jen, and thanks, Alan. Really appreciate your time today.
Our pleasure. Take care.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.